Commonwealth. We are all independent doing our own things. We are a civil society working with the Commonwealth Secretariat. The main 4 areas of interest are environment, literacy, communities and equality. But within that, we have a wide range of interests. One of the interests that we have here in Adelaide is that we have our own instrumental ensemble, and we're supporting a number of young artists, including a terrific string quartet called Bronzewing. So if you hear, they have played down at Flinders University. So if you see Bronzewing advertised, do please support them. They're a terrific group of people. We have international meetings from time to time, and in 2016 the international meeting was in London, and as Flinders was my alma mater, I knew about the statue of Matthew Flinders in the Euston train station. So I went to have a look at it, and I was accosted when I was seen taking photos.
I thought you were accosted.
Well, we accosted. It was a mutual accostation because we were both there taking photos of this fabulous statue, and it worked out we were both related to Flinders University, and lost touch until we were at the opera march past, arriving with masks, and believe it or not, I recognised her and said, "Oi!" And so we had coffee, and she brought me up to date with what was happening with Matthew Flinders, and I said, "We need to talk about this." So without further ado, may I introduce Dr Gillian Dooley. Thank you.
Many thanks, Livy. I'm just extremely honoured that the Society has asked me to speak today. Of course, first off, I would like to acknowledge this is the beginning of National Reconciliation Week, of course, today. So I would anyway want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the countries, the country that Flinders visited. And in South Australia, that was the lands of the Minung people, the Nauru land at Coffin Bay. It was Bangala land around Port Lincoln, and then Nukanu land at the head of the Gulf, Ghana land, of course, and the island of Carter, which is now we now call Kangaroo Island, and the encounter was off the lands of the Nurrungeri people. So I would definitely want to pay respects to the elders past and present and future of the Aboriginal people of Australia, and part of my work with Flinders has been trying to sort of go back and see what happened with those encounters that he had with the Aboriginal people, so that's a very important part of what I've been doing. Right. So now today I couldn't decide what to tell you about, so I thought I should ask you. So I've got 4 talks here. We could just start at the beginning. I could read them all if you like, or else I thought I might just start telling you about some aspect of Flinders, and please just put your hand up at any stage and ask me anything you feel like, anything you're interested in about Flinders. I'm not saying I know everything about Flinders. I will try to answer. If I can't answer, I'll take the question on notice. Some of my cards are out on the table if you want to grab one and email me later. So this young man, Matthew Flinders, born in Donington in 1774, in Donington, Lincolnshire, joined the Royal Navy at the age of 15 or 16, round about then. Very old to join the Navy in those days. He was a late starter, and partly because his father didn't want him to. 1794, travelled to Australia with, it wasn't called Australia then, of course, travelled to New South Wales with Governor Hunter. And over the next few years he did explorations with George Bass, with that and by himself as well, around the coast and around Tasmania. In 1800 he returned to the UK, and he immediately started negotiating with Sir Joseph Banks and the Admiralty to lead the expedition to finish the charting of the whole coast, which was his big ambition, to finish what had been left still to do. In 1801, in April 1801, he married Anne Chapelle, hoping to take her with him, sort of under the radar, which some people say, well, that was completely unrealistic. Other people say, well, it wasn't that actually, it was fairly normal, but you had to pretend it wasn't happening. And he unfortunately his cover got blown. He had to leave her behind. And of course he came to explore the Australian coast in the Investigator. Then there was the whole circumnavigation and all the explorations he did and all the misfortunes he had with rotten ships and all that sort of thing. 1803, he was rushing back to England to try and get a new ship. He went to the Isle of France, or Ile de France, now Mauritius, to get some supplies, to get his ship mended, and was taken captive because the governor didn't believe that he was who he said he was, and he had the wrong sort of passport, and he thought he was a spy and all these things. It was very unfortunate, and he was detained on the Ile de France until 1810, when the British were about to come back to retake or take Mauritius from the French, and returned to England, reunited with Anne without an E. Anne with an E was born on the 1st of April, and 1812, and Matthew died in July 1814. That, of course, is, a phonetically abbreviated version of his life, but it's just the sort of bare bones to give you something to hang it off. So these are some of the things I've talked about in the past, and I've had, I've researched and found out about. So if there's anything on there that makes you, piques your interest, do just put your hand up and let me know if you want to ask me anything. But meanwhile, I might just tell you, shall we talk about Matthew Flinders in South Australia, or shall we talk about his early life in his family life? Which would you like to start with? South Australia. Okay. Good. Thank you. So I might be able to quickly just bring up the appropriate PowerPoint for this if I'm clever enough. Here we go. This is a talk I gave at the Pioneers Association on Proclamation Day last year. Here we go, okay. So Flinders didn't know it, but on the 26th of January 1802, he entered South Australian waters at longitude 129 degrees east. As far as he was concerned, he was mapping Neutsland. I probably said that wrong, but if there are any Dutch speakers here, please do correct me. He was mapping Neutsland, New Holland. He was passing along the land of the men and people. I bet this doesn't work. It doesn't work. Okay. I'm going to have to do this. There are two sources of information for charting this voyage. One is the captain's log of the Investigator, which you can see the blue one on the left. Yes? That, yeah. One thing I can never do is left and right. The blue one is the captain's log of the Investigator, which was published in, I think, in 2014, or around about then, edited by Kenneth Morgan, of a British scholar. And that is the day-to-day, it's actually the fair copy of the day-to-day captain's log. And the other source of information is his published Voyage to Terra Australis, which was published in 1814, just before he died. And they're not identical, of course. There's hindsight involved in writing up the voyage, and also what you might write for your colleagues to read, to keep a track, and what you might write for publication is not the same thing. So in the captain's log on this day, the 26th of January 1802, along with descriptions of the terrain as it could be seen from the ship, low and sandy, with wooded land further back, he describes a fire made close down upon the beach, which seemed to be intended for our observation. This interesting information This interesting intimation that he was aware of being watched from the shore is not repeated in the voyage narrative published in 1814. On the 28th, there we are, Fowler's Bay, there's a map. On the 28th of January, they anchored in what he named Fowler's Bay after Robert Fowler, his first lieutenant. In both accounts, he describes finding some dogs' footprints and some decayed spears, but no huts or anything that showed them to have been here lately. In fact, although in the captain's log, Flinders recounts several direct encounters elsewhere during his circumnavigation of Australia, there were to be no direct encounters with the Aboriginal people on the shores of what is now South Australia. They saw some Aboriginal people in the distance on Nauvoo land at Coffin Bay, and they heard some in the distance in what is now Port Lincoln. In the Investigator logbook, Flinders made some remarks on the behaviour of the Aboriginal people at Port Lincoln. And this is William Westall, the landscape artist's picture of Port Lincoln. This morning, some natives were heard calling, as we supposed, to a boat which had just then landed at the tents, and two of them were seen at about half a mile from us. But they soon walked away, or perhaps retired into the woods to watch our motions. No attempts were made to follow them, as I have always found the natives of New Holland, that they avoid those that seem anxious to communicate with them, but if left entirely alone, will usually come down after having watched our actions for 4 or 5 days. Now, this is more considered and better informed than the presumptuous statements made by previous European visitors like Joseph Banks. Moreover, Flinders added in the published voyage, "Nor does this conduct seem to be unnatural, for what in such case would be the conduct of any people, ourselves for instance, were we living in a state of nature, frequently at war with our neighbours, and ignorant of the existence of any other nation?" Now, Flinders was in the mental habit of making a statement or thinking a thought and then seeking the balancing idea. A scientific cast of mind might explain this automatic weighing of ideas before coming to a decision, but it also seems to me to be a sign of a well-developed moral imagination, the recognition of another point of view, a reluctance to rush to judgment, a wariness of prejudice. And perhaps this is a habit which encourages balance not only in rhetoric, but in moral thought. The kind of day-to-day official writing that Flinders did isn't really conducive to the expression of personal opinion and morality, although sometimes he did it anyway. There's a nice picture of the encounter by John Ford. And I don't think that was what I had in mind. There we are. These are some of the publications. The journal that he kept while detained in Mauritius and for the few remaining years of his life in London, though it still remains a scrupulous record of weather, events and activities, allowed him more scope to express his feelings and his thoughts about society and history when he was inclined to do so. In this private journal, which is the blue book, some of you might have seen it out on the table there, in this private journal and in his personal correspondence, we discover a man who might be ambitious and determined in his efforts to make his mark as an explorer, but who is far from narcissistic. Whether writing to his wife, a family member or a friend, he's always concerned for their welfare, willing to give them the benefit of the doubt if he hadn't received a letter he'd expected, for example. He understood very well and shared the grief he caused his wife, Anne, by leaving her behind in England in 1801. In 1805, he sent her a set of lyrics he had set to a song, which she wrote from the woman's point of view about the pain she felt at being left behind to mourn. And it took me 15 years to find out what the melody of that song was. It's the slow movement of Haydn's Imperial Symphony, somewhat altered enough so that none of the usual tune recognition programs would recognise it, but probably written from memory. Anyway, other instances of his tendency to consider quite different point of view include his description of the likely fate of his cat Trim, whom he speculated might have been eaten by a hungry slave on Mauritius, rather than killed by someone greedy or cruel, and also his rather heroic effort at imagining the motives and reasoning of his arch enemy, Captain General de Caen, the governor of Mauritius, who was responsible for his lengthy detention. He even speculated in a romantic way about the fate of the pelicans on Kangaroo Island, and I will talk about that a bit more later. When they entered Spencer's Gulf for the first time, as he wrote 10 years later in the voyage, large rivers, deep inlets, inland seas and passages into the Gulf of Carpentaria were the terms frequently used in our conversation of this evening, and the prospect of making an interesting discovery seemed to have infused new life and vigour into every man in the ship. That life and vigour were to be knocked out of them, however, on the very next day. In a bay on the tip of what we now know of as Eyre Peninsula, there's probably going to be a map here somewhere. No. I don't know. Somewhere. There we are. In the bay at the southern tip of what we know as Eyre Peninsula, Midshipman William Taylor and 6 seamen went to the shore in a cutter to search for water, and they never returned. Flinders assumed that they were caught in the dangerous ripplings of tide that had overturned the boat. The boat was found and some of their belongings, but no trace of the bodies of their shipmates. I'm supposed to have a slide for this. There we go, yeah. So, as every search has been now made for our unfortunate shipmates that we could think had any prospect of being attended with success, I thought it would avail nothing to remain longer on this account, for there was only a small chance of obtaining these bodies when they might rise to the surface from the number of sharks that we have constantly seen about. Even this small chance of obtaining their bodies would have induced me to wait a few days longer, had not the want of water been so pressing to hurry us forward. I caused a stout post to be erected in the cove, and to it was nailed a sheet of copper on which was engraven the following inscription, and there we are, the memory cove, and the list of the people: John Thistle, the master, William Taylor, the midshipman, and 6 of the crew. Nautici cavete, sailors beware. This was the voyage's first fatality, and Flinders felt it keenly. All the boat's crew, he says, were active and useful young men, and in a small and complete ship's company, which had so many duties to perform, this diminution of our force was heavily felt. But Thistle was a particularly sad loss. He'd known Thistle since 1794, when they sailed together on the Reliance from England to Sydney, and as he wrote in the log, "We have been mostly together since that time." His zeal in the cause of discovery had induced him to join the Investigator when at Spithead and ready to sail, although he had returned to England only 3 weeks before from a distant voyage of 6 years' continuance. That's loyalty, isn't it? A man after Flinders' own heart. Flinders wrote to Anne that it will grieve thee as it has me to understand that poor Thistle was lost upon the south coast. Thou knowest how I valued him. He is, however, gone. Thistle Island, of course, is named after him, and each of the other 7 who were lost has an island named for them. Cape Catastrophe and Memory Cove, also named in commemoration of those lost men and that day. It's also possible that Flinders' heightened feelings of grief and loss are expressed in the other names he gave around this area. Cape Donington after his birthplace, Port Lincoln after the county of his birth, Boston Island for the nearest large town to Donington, and so on. This was Bangala land, and their name for Port Lincoln was Galiniala. As they continued up the west coast of Spencer Gulf, you probably know the map, but I mean, there you are. Anyway, on March the 10th, at the head of the Gulf, the scientific gentleman, that is Robert Brown, the naturalist, and William Westall, the landscape painter, and Ferdinand Bauer, the botanical artist, they went ashore to climb Mount Brown, and Flinders also landed on Nukunu land to explore the land, the head of the Gulf. The D'Entrecasteaux map. I've got these out of order somehow. Don't know how. Okay. Oh. Could be easier this too. Oh well, anyway. Sorry. It was something of a disappointment to them that the Gulf turned out not to be a strait dividing Australia. There we go. I'll find it. Because, there we go. This might explain it a bit better. Because you can see the blank bit where we are. They didn't know whether there was a strait going up to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and that was what they were. That was more or less, that was part of the rationale for the voyage, to find out whether there was a strait. It was something of a disappointment to them that the Gulf turned out not to be a strait. And a channel capable of leading us up into the Gulf of Carpentaria, as had been discussed excitedly 3 weeks earlier. And 3 weeks after he visited the head of Spencer Gulf, Flinders went ashore at the head of Gulf St Vincent on the 30th of March. They had proposed to ascend what he called Hummocky Mountains, now known as South Hummocks. had not its distance been found beyond the bounds of returning to the ship in the evening. They surveyed the east coast of the Gulf, Ghana land, of course, from the ship. They made observations of Mount Lofty, but they didn't land. He noticed that the land has a pleasant appearance, being grassy hills of gentle ascent with clumps of trees interspersed, but I judge it to be barren rather than fertile. The contrast between this lowland and the opposite shore is great, that being mountainous and stony. So he didn't pick this as a site for what would become one of the world's most livable cities. It's only a few days later that he visited Pelican Lagoon on Kangaroo Island and wrote those lines which in Voyage to Terra Australis were expanded to include the immortal phrase, "Alas for the pelicans." Kangaroo Island was known to the mainland inhabitants as Kata, the island of the dead. It had been uninhabited for several thousand years when Flinders arrived. And I've got this. I have to click through. The eastern head of the lagoon contains 3 islands, of which 2 seem to be breeding places for pelicans. On the third, we did not land. The birds were in great numbers, many of them too young to fly. From the quantity of scattered bones and skeletons upon the islands, I infer that the pelicans not only commence their being here, but that they have selected this retreat for the closing scene of their existence. Here, at a distance from man, the great disturber of all, surrounded by his feathered progeny, and in the very same spot where he first emerged from his own shelly prison. In this retreat, the aged pelican can quietly resign his small portion of ethereal flame back to the great eternal source of vitality whence it emanated, without having his last moments interrupted, and perhaps without a pang. Requiescant ossa in pace, barbare. He apologised in a note to his readers for these sentimental conjectures and exclamations and requested them to pardon this touch of the melancholy, though not unpleasing, reflections which took hold of my mind on viewing this uncommon cemetery where the young wingless pelican was seen scrambling over the bones of his parent. This entry was written in the log on the 5th of April 1802. Now, Flinders called it Kangaroo Island because of the abundance of kangaroos, which afforded them fresh food for the first time in a very long time. He notes in Voyage to Terra Australis that he killed 10 and the other members of his party another 20. Even then he called it butchery, for the poor animals suffered themselves to be shot in the eyes with small shot, and in some cases to be knocked over the head with sticks. He had reason to feel melancholy and to be contemplating death and mortality after the loss of his shipmates. And 3 days after that, he met Nicolas Baudin on the Géographe for the first time, and on the 8th and 9th of April 1802. He named the place Encounter Bay. This was off the lands of the Nurrungeri people, and this encounter is, of course, the subject of many accounts by many authors, some quite romantic, some heroic. It's interesting to read the first accounts of it from Flinders' log. On going on board, I requested to see their passport. That's their passport from the British government, which was shown to me, and I offered mine for inspection, but Captain Baudin put it back without looking at it. Captain Baudin was sufficiently communicative of his discoveries about Van Diemen's Land and of his remarks about my chart of Bass Strait, many parts of which he condemned, but I was gratified to hear him say that the north side of Van Diemen's Land was well laid down and the islands near it. As Captain Baudin had an imperfect copy of my miscellaneous chart of Bass Strait, I presented him the next morning with a copy of 3 charts lately published and the small memoir attached to them. On my requesting to know the name of the commander of the Naturaliste, the Géographe's companion ship, he, apropos, begged to know mine, and finding it was the same as that of the author of the Charter of Bass's Strait, which he had been criticising, he expressed some surprise and congratulation. But I did not apprehend that my being here at this time, so far along the unknown part of the coast, gave him any great pleasure. Flinders couldn't have known about the tensions on board the Géographe, but it's interesting that Baudin's antagonist, François Perron, recorded a favourable first impression of Flinders from this time, and this once again is what Perron wrote on that day. Mr. Flinders is a man of 40 to 45 years of age. He was 28. Short, thin and spare. He has a sharp and piercing gaze. His face is full of expression and his features animated. All of his movements point to an ardent and impetuous character. His manners are those of a prudent and sensitive man. His conduct towards us was tactful and generous. That's a translation by Jean Fornaciero and John West Suby of Adelaide University. Now, later on, Perron would not be so complimentary, but this is a precious first-person account of what Flinders was like to meet. Flinders wrote so many words, and he often talked about himself explicitly, usually self-critically, as well as revealing his personality and character in what he wrote. But there are not many eyewitness accounts like this. Oh, there we are. After the encounter, there wasn't any point in duplicating the effort of the French. Flinders naturally ceded naming rights to them for that portion of the coast they had visited before him. So it was only 10 days later, on the 19th of April, that they left South Australian waters and crossed the present border into Victoria at 140 degrees 58 east. They had been 83 days in South Australian waters. So that's Flinders in South Australia. If you've got any questions about that, hello.
Mount Lofty.
Mount Lofty.
Did Flinders name it Mount Lofty?
Yes.
After whom did he name it?
I think he just thought it was a lofty mountain. It was the most lofty of the of the hills, and I think that was purely a descriptive.
Yes,
yes.
I wondered whether one of the seamen may have been factored.
No.
Another question about naming. Willoughby, Cape Willoughby on Kangaroo Island was named by Flinders, but after whom there's some suggestion that it's named after a town in
Lincolnshire,
called Willoughby, or it's named after a person.
Is there a town in Lincolnshire called Willoughby?
I think I've read that there is.
Yeah, I haven't come across that. That's one I don't know. I'm sorry. He usually, in the Voyage to Terra Australis, he usually gives the reason for naming, for what his name, for the names he's given. But I'm not sure about that one. But I'm sure someone else would know, and I'm sure I would be able to find out if you're interested in me following up. So, any other questions at the moment, Rosanna?
I was wondering, I think I've read somewhere that England was at war with France when they encountered each other. How did that first encounter go with them not knowing where they were in history?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Rosanna's asked England was at war with France, but of course they couldn't know that, having been at sea for about 9 months, and not having, perhaps they'd put in somewhere and been able to get some news on the way, but they'd been at sea for some months without any way of getting any news. They both Baudin and Flinders were committed to this as a scientific voyage for the greater good of humankind, rather than as a national project. that was, Flinders often sort of went off into these wonderful rhetorical flights of, and said, I serve science and not I'm not interested in war. I don't want to fight battles. I'm interested in the pursuit of science and knowledge. That was certainly, and each of them had a passport for their voyage from the other side's government. So the French government had provided. The British government first provided Baudin with a passport, which is what actually made them put the skates on and send Flinders. But he had to get his passport from the French first. But then of course when he ended up in Sydney in 1803. With the rotten, because the investigator turned out to be rotten. They found out up in the Northern Territory, around the Gulf of Carpentaria, around all further east, and he just kept going for a little while. But he knew that if they encountered a monsoon, storms, they would probably go down. So he really just had to. The reason they circumnavigated was to follow the prevailing winds rather than to try and sail into the monsoon, because the ship wouldn't take it. So the circumnavigation was in a way not a mistake, but it was incidental. It wasn't really what he was after doing. He was after mapping the blank bits and checking the rest of the findings.
Can I interrupt for a second? According to Wikipedia, Cape Willoughby was named after a village in Lincolnshire, but interestingly enough, Google Maps doesn't have a Willoughby in Lincolnshire, and it was originally known as the Sturt Light after Captain Charles Sturt. So you're no better off.
Thank you, Libby. There may or may not be a town in Lincolnshire called Willoughby, and it may or may not be named after that. So further,
clear as mud.
Yes, further investigation required. Daryl, did you have a question?
Yeah, a trivial question.
Okay, good.
Is it true that Baudin and Flinders met on Baudin's vessel?
Yes.
And one of the reasons was that he couldn't bear the thought of eating English food. Baudin couldn't bear the thought of going and eating English food.
Well, if that's true, I don't think there wasn't really I don't know that dining was really at the top of their agenda at the moment. No, they did actually have breakfast together. So the question is whether Flinders was on Baudin's vessel because Baudin didn't want to eat English food. Well, I mean, the rations that either of the ships had must have been pretty basic, and especially, well, yes, they probably had some salted kangaroo, and of course there was seafood, I suppose, that they could catch. Yes, indeed, but no, I think Flinders approached Baudin's. I mean, as far as I know, Flinders sort of took the initiative and went to see Baudin, and that was sort of in the evening or the late afternoon, and then Baudin invited him to come back for breakfast the next morning. I don't know that there was any question of Baudin boarding the... I mean, the Géographe is a much bigger ship than the Investigator, so, they had sort of size and prestige maybe on their side. Who put their hand up?
Anyone else?
No. Oh, there's one here first. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Right, I was just wondering if you could touch on his luck with ships. and what that encompassed, and how did he end up with the rotten ship?
His luck with ships,
Yes.
his lack of luck with ships. Yes, well, yes, I mean, I'm not a naval historian, so I have heard people say that if he'd been more experienced, he would have realised that the Investigator was not going to be a suitable ship. It was a collier which was sort of repurposed for the voyage, and there was the coppers, the bottom was recoppered, and he did see it being sort of prepared, but I don't know what whether he could have told from the time that he left that there was a potential problem. So they were at sea for 2 years, I suppose, before, and they would have at Sydney in July 1802. They would have, taken the ship down and careened it and done all those things that they do to ships and cleaned it and all that sort of thing. But when they got to the north, and the carpenter said, "Hey, look, I think there's some rotten boards there," and so Flinders said, "Well, let's get a full report on this," and that was that sort of very devastating sort of report that he gave, and so the next thing that happened was. So he went back they limped back to Sydney, and by that time their luck with health too, the health of the crew had kind of deteriorated because they took on dysentery with the water in Timor. So so a lot of men died of dysentery. And scurvy because just the diet was just not adequate. The regime he had when he had the supplies was very strict. That they should have their sauerkraut and whatever else it was that they had to have to ward off scurvy. But they would have run out of supplies. So he went to Timor to take on supplies and to take on water. Got the dysentery with the water. Came back round to Sydney with the rotten Investigator, said to the governor, "Look, I've just got to get back to England to get another ship to finish my work. I'm only halfway through." And so he went off in a ship called the Porpoise, which was sailing back to, he was a passenger on that ship. It was going back to England. So he was a passenger on that ship up off the coast off the Great Barrier Reef. It hit an uncharted reef along with its companion ship, the Cato. They were wrecked. They camped on a sandbank for 6 weeks or so. Flinders got in one of the boats, the open whale boats of the ship, with I think a crew of somebody correct me, 8 or 12 people, not very many, rowing. It was a sail. It did have a sail, but it was 732 miles, I think. They had to go back over the open sea, and they got back to Flinders to Sydney in 2 weeks, and then frantically, burst into the governor's dinner and said, "Here, help! We're shipwrecked. We need help." Governor King was very helpful and did what he could, but the only ship he had available was this little one called the Cumberland, which was 29 tonnes, which was, the Investigator was 334 tonnes, and that was a smallish ship. 29 tonnes is tiny. It's a crew of 12 people. And Flinders said, he had some ambition of being the first person to sail so small a ship back from Australia to England, And he didn't make it because the pumps stopped working, in the Indian Ocean, and he had to drop into Mauritius. The governor there was not friendly, as we've seen, kept him there. Bye-bye, Daryl. He told me he'd have to leave early. So that was his luck with ships, not very good. And of course there was some risk-taking there. There's some risk-taking. If he'd succeeded, he would have been the greatest guy on earth, and a lot of things he did try that he succeeded, but those risks he took were failed. So yeah.
Can we perhaps jump, as I said,
Oh, sorry.
5 to 6?
Is it 5 to 6 already? Okay.
Can we perhaps jump to Euston Station?
All right.
the
Okay.
statue and what's happened since?
Okay. Yes. As far as I'm concerned, we can keep going till 20 past, but it's up to you. We've got some other questions.
Can I make a comment about the ship?
Yeah, please do.
Captain Cook refused to have colour on his ship
Oh yeah.
because the copper on the nails was a chemical polish.
Uh-huh.
So he had his was a Whitney collier as well.
Yeah. Right.
He
Okay.
had a double temper.
Uh-huh.
So
Good.
obviously Captain Cook knew
Thank you.
more than
Yes. Okay. Good. Have you just got something quick, or did you have?
It's probably more related to Bodana. Was that the trip that he collected pieces of pottery at King's Cove on Kangaroo Island?
Would have. Oh, it might have been, but then they came back later. That's an interesting question. But
Around that time.
yeah, it was either then or later that year, I think. Yeah. Okay, so Euston Station. Well, yes, I mean in February 2019, I suddenly started getting emails about they've found Matthew Flinders. Now I knew they were digging up the Euston Station, and and I thought, oh well, there was something. The estimates of the number of people that were buried there was between 40 and 60,000 people. And I thought, how on earth are they going to find one person there? It's vanishingly unlikely that they'll find him, but they did. So at the time, on that day, I was travelling on the overland to Melbourne, and I spent the whole trip fielding media queries by email and phone. And when I arrived, I had to stay up to midnight to talk to the BBC TV while they broke the news. We knew roughly where he was buried, in St James's churchyard. His sister-in-law Isabella, went to visit his grave in 1854 after Anne's death, and found the cemetery swept of all the tombs and gravestones. The land was built over when Euston Station was expanded in the late 19th century. And then the HS2 project began in 2018, and archaeologists excavated the graveyard before the new building began. And it's thanks to an engraved lead plate on his coffin that they identified him. I think I've got a picture of the lead plate. Oh, there it is. That down in the corner there. That actually, if you can see it, you can see it close up too. It's quite difficult to read, but it was enough to identify him. So somebody was thinking ahead at that stage. I was lucky enough to be in London for a commemorative event at Australia House on the 28th of June 2019, that year. And I met the archaeologist who actually made the initial discovery, and I saw that lead nameplate. So she told me that it was I said, well, what did you actually find? Because what is there after 200 years? And she said dry bones and splinters. The coffin was all disintegrated and splintered, but there was this lead nameplate, so they found that. So they were to be reinterred in Donington Church with his father and other family members on the anniversary of his death last year in 2020. With celebrations by all the people who campaigned so hard to bring him home. There's a Facebook group called Matthew Flinders Bring Him Home. And these included his direct descendant, very sadly, the late Lisette Flinders Petrie, who only died a month or two ago, and her daughters. We're hoping that this might happen, probably not this year, maybe next year, who knows. Yes, there was a bit of a push to bring Flinders out here, to bring the bones out here, which I did not support. And so I kept being quoted saying these things. This is the Spalding newspaper from Spalding, Lincolnshire. Spalding is, of course, the main town. Donington's just sort of an outskirt of Spalding these days. Spalding Herald. So I was, I had to sort of be a little bit flexible, I suppose, with the truth and say things like, he always wanted to be buried in the countryside. Well, he wanted to retire to the countryside. And he was an Englishman, and we spent, as we've seen, he spent 87 days in South Australian waters out of 40 years of his life. It's not, it's significant to us, but it's, to him, he had the rest of his life. His family was there. He was very, very embedded in his family and his friendships and all that sort of thing. So it didn't seem to me the right that he should be sort of shipped out here and buried here. No, so.
Was he recognised for his achievements over there?
Was he recognised for his achievements? Look, when he got back, oh dear, when he got back, he was, he knew he had, that the voyage had to be written up. This voyage, which had, he got back 7 years after the voyage had finished, after he'd finished or, stopped doing what he had to do, what he was able to do. So he basically spent the rest of his life writing the voyage. And what he did at first was to write a 200-page history of the exploration of Terra Australis from the very, very first records. And it's an amazing piece of scholarship. And he couldn't do that in Mauritius because he needed the libraries which were in London. He needed the British Library, but he even more needed Sir Joseph Banks's library. And so he wrote that, and then he had to redo all his chart observations because there was a mistake in the Astronomer Royal's. This is probably not right, but there was a mistake in the calculations for the charts that he'd been, for the astronomical charts he'd been working with to make so everything had to be recalculated with his brother Samuel, which was a little bit of a difficult issue in many ways. And then, so he was there 3.5 years, basically nose to the grindstone, writing this voyage. He did some other scientific experiments. and then at the end of 1813, he started saying, actually, I'm not feeling very well, and it all went downhill from there, and he died in July, 19th of July. What killed him? It was probably a urinary tract infection, which was never properly treated. In our our edition of the voyage of the private journal, we got a medical practitioner to look at Flinders' diary because he described his symptoms in excruciating detail and the treatment that he'd been taking. So it was the treatment was probably exacerbating it and making it worse. So, so that's an appendix in that private journal edition. Yeah. So now.
He was obviously very well educated and for a young man at 16 and to be able to write as he did.
Yeah.
What was his family background?
His father was a surgeon and man midwife. So he was a medical man and an educated man, but he did his training at Edinburgh University. He wanted Matthew to be, to follow him and to do the same, follow the same profession. But Matthew was determined to go to sea. He later said it was from reading Robinson Crusoe that he wanted to go to sea. But he went to a local, just the local sort of primary school, or probably what they would call a dame school in those days. He spent 2 years at what is now the high school in Donington. So he was there for sort of ages of 14, 15, and he learnt Latin but he's apparently supposed to have read things like the elements of navigation and trigonometry, and he sort of by himself because that's just what he wanted to do. He was just so focused. So I think there was no university, of course, no, but he read widely, all sorts of things. He read novels, he read poetry, he read Milton, he read, he just read and read and read. And then he was a midshipman on Bligh's voyage, and Governor Bligh, for all his faults, Captain Bligh, was a good captain in the sense that he taught his midshipmen well. So he would have learnt the elements of navigation and all that sort of thing, and how to map and how to, all this seamanship, for want of a better word, and that sort of thing from Bligh, who, of course, learnt it from Cook. So Flinders was very proud of that, that sort of, that link with Cook. Flinders was terribly embarrassed to be correcting Cook's charts. He thought, how dare I? Cook is the greatest ever, and here am I, daring to say, no, actually he was wrong, he was 30 miles out. But I've got better instruments than he has, that's it. That was all he could, that was his excuse. But he was very apologetic about that in his account. How are we off for time now?
Fine. They're expecting us across the road sometime between 1:15 and 6:30. So if you've got more conversation, if you've got more questions, if you want to pontificate about anything, do feel free. It's an informal group.
Yes.
And you haven't mentioned Trim.
I haven't mentioned Trim. No. Well, Trim, yes. So what do we know about Trim? He was the reason we know about Trim, of course, is because Flinders wrote the biographical tribute to the memory of Trim. And he wrote that, he seems to have started writing it in about 1807. He said, when not otherwise occupied, I have lately employed myself either in correcting my narrative, in reading Grant's History of the Isle of France and making notes upon it, or in translating into French the history of my cat Trim, which I wrote out for the purpose. So he said that in 1807. On the manuscript, on the fair manuscript which we've got, it says 1809. So presumably he polished it up, and I'm not sure what. I don't know that French translation still exists. That would be a wonderful thing to find in an archive in Mauritius somewhere. So we know that Trim existed because he mentions him in a couple of letters to Anne. He mentioned him in a letter to Governor King. He said, because this was on the Cumberland, so writing to King from the Cumberland before they got to Mauritius, he says, "Of all the filthy little things I ever saw, this schooner for bugs, lice, fleas, weevils, mosquitoes, cockroaches large and small, and mice rises superior to them all." He describes the measures they were taking against the various insects, with the bugs being the most persistent. He suggested that before this vile bug-like smell will leave me, I must, I believe, as well as my clothes, undergo a good boiling in the large kettle. But of course the rodents were easily dealt with. "I shall set my old friend Trim to work upon the mice," he said. And he knew he could rely on his faithful, intelligent, sporting and affectionate, useful feline friend. There's that letter, there's another letter, a couple of letters to Anne where he mentions Trim, because Trim would have known, Anne would have got to know Trim when she was on the ship before. But what happened to Trim really is anybody's guess. He was sent to, when they were detained. So what happened was, when he first got to Mauritius, they were detained in something called the Café Marengo, which seems to have been some sort of hotel. They were all just in a room. He was in a room with his servant and the cat, and a guard posted at the door, and it was very, very uncomfortable. When they were allowed a little bit more freedom, a place called the Maison Dépôt, or the Garden Prison, he was afraid that Trim would, get out in the garden and run away. So he allowed Trim to go and live with a lady and her little daughter, and to be looked after. But Trim probably didn't go for that much, being petted and treated like a like a cat instead of a member of the crew, and he disappeared. And they put out the rewards and everything, but he was never seen again. And so who knows? I mean, in the edition which Lily has kindly.
I have read this. It is wonderful. I totally unreservedly recommend it. It is written by Matthew Flinders, Philippa Sandell and Gillian Dooley, but I've got to say that most of it is written by Trim.
So Philippa Sandell is a wonderful writer, and it was her idea to do this new edition. There have been half a dozen editions already of the biographical tribute, but we went back to the manuscript and we've included everything, even the most obscure references to Egyptian mythology and everything. And also Philippa, being the sort of person she is, could write Trim's point of view. So she's written what Trim's version of events.
The corrections.
The corrections, yes. and you know, that Trim wouldn't have just been caught. I mean, why would Trim be caught? When I was in in Mauritius, I probably haven't got time to find the slide, but when I was in Mauritius, I was visiting the Grand Bassin, which is one of the places where Flinders used to go hunting with his friends. And just in the bushes there, I saw this little black and white cat. I thought, okay. And he just kept following me around. And so I took a few photos of this this little black and white cat. I thought, right, okay, Trim's probably, you know, his genes are probably still here. But, you know, would he have just sort of made his way back to the port and found a ship, you know, re-enlisted, or what? I don't know. I mean, of course, he could have come to a sticky end. He was either 5 years or 7 years old. That we're not sure actually. The date that Flinders gives for his birth is 1797, but that doesn't really add up with the ship that he was on at the time. So I think we think it's 1799 rather than 1797. So he was still a youngish cat, you know, still in the prime of his life. So he could well have just escaped and found somewhere else to live, or jumped ship or whatever. So,
Gillian, how did the statue come about?
The statue. Have I got a photo of the statue somewhere? The statue came about because a chap called Peter Ashley was really dead keen to get something in some kind of recognition of Flinders near his birthplace, or near the place of his death. So he was wanting just something like perhaps a plaque on a granite plinth or something like that. There's that cat. There we go. There it is. So that's the statue. It's just been unveiled at the Flinders. A copy of it is now at the Flinders railway station down near Flinders University. So take a trip on the train down there and have a look at it. But Peter just wanted. This was about 2011. I just arrived in England in time to go to a meeting that he'd called with various people to try and get something done. And he was saying, "Oh, can we just raise, £5,000 to get this done?" But the people at the meeting were much more ambitious than that, and saying, "Well, surely we could get a bust built that would, maybe £20,000-30,000." And then by the end of the year, we were looking at a full life size. Well, this is actually 5:4 life size. He's bigger, larger than life, and so that's how it happened. And we got some people on board who were very, very good at fundraising. We had a fundraiser here downstairs, and with the way that they did it was the sculptor Mark Richards, who's a brilliant sculptor, made little maquettes, small versions, quarter-size versions, which he sold for £4,500 each. And people were just, yes, buying them like crazy. And we had this cocktail party downstairs. It was 45 minutes, and we'd raised $82,000 in 45 minutes. I've never seen anything like it. I was just... But we were very lucky to have the help of the Agent General's office in the UK, and also John Allen, who's part of one of the big mineral exploration companies, and the Pauline Lyle-Smith of the Britain Australian Society. So there were various people who knew people who could call, who knew how to do this. And I mean, Peter Ashley, who's a retired commander from the Royal Navy, and a dedicated Flinders scholar, and he did his master's degree on Flinders, wrote a biography of him. But he didn't have those sort of connections. So it was at that meeting, when I'd just flown in, I just got off the plane at Heathrow and went straight to this meeting. And then all this suddenly happened. It was really quite amazing. And so it was unveiled by Prince William at Australia House, I think, on Flinders, the anniversary of Flinders' death, 19 July 2014. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there, but I was there later in the year instead. So.
I've seen the statue several years ago after it was installed on the concourse at Euston Station.
Yeah.
But unlike Libby, I did not have any success in photographing.
No, it's hopeless because everybody sits on it.
Yes, the plinth is about that high,
Yeah.
and it's quite large.
Yeah.
And people are either sitting there, they've got their briefcases there,
Yeah.
or their cups of coffee.
Yeah, yeah.
It was very difficult to get
Yeah,
a
well,
good
when they first put it there inside, that was inside, and it's underneath the timetable.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's where it was for a while, and the members of the committee, we were throwing ideas around about what to do about that, because it was too dark anyway. Also, and people would just come in and they would be looking at the. They'd be looking at the timetable. They wouldn't be looking at the statue. It was in a fairly dark spot, and so we knew that it wasn't in a very good place. It's now outside. So if you go outside the station, there's a sort of walkway there. It's right in the middle there. People still sit on it, but there are chairs around it now. So there's a sort of outdoor cafe sort of scene there now. I quite like it when the children come and pat Trim on the head and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it was always, do we kind of put up barbed wire around it to stop people doing that, or do we allow people to sort of engage with it? It was always a bit difficult to know, but anyway, it is now, I think, in a much better place. And there's a copy at Port Lincoln, which was so that the Mark, he had these sort of parameters. He would make a certain number of maquettes for sale. They sold more than we needed to actually build the statues, make the statue, and the leftover money went to Flinders University for scholarships, for international scholarships, and he would only make 2 other replicas. So we've got 1 replica, and the other replica is at Port Lincoln. So that was sort of part of the terms of the agreement.
Gillian, I can't remember. Is Flinders being reinterred now?
No.
He hasn't? No. Okay.
No. I can't say that I know exactly where his remains are at the moment, but they're being looked after by the archaeologists who disinterred, who found him. I'm not sure what's happened to all those graves, actually.
60,000 sounds like an awful lot of problem.
Yes, exactly. It was up to the decision about whether he was going to be reinterred at Donington eventually came down to, it was down to the Anglican Church. Odd, that seemed odd to me, that it wasn't the family who had the say, but it was the Anglican Church. So they'd got the Bishop of Lincoln on their side to say, yes, we want him to be brought back to Donington, but they had to get the church authorities to agree to that.
Where was his wife?
His wife was interred in Charlton in St Thomas's Church, which is just along the river from Greenwich. So I went there 2 years ago, and I found the gravestones have been sort of leant up against a fence, but I did meet someone there from the church who knew the story. There was a plaque, a marble plaque, which used to be there, and which was moved here. I can't remember when, but it was moved to Flinders, Victoria. Somebody talked somebody into letting them take it from there and plant it in Flinders, Victoria. But they've now got some sort of replica there. So Anne and her sister Isabella, who lived with her for the rest of her life, were both, and also Anne Junior were buried there, I think. And of course, Anne Junior became the mother of Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the famous archaeologist.
Good. The statue's gorgeous.
Yes, it really is wonderful. Yeah. Yeah.
I think most of it's going on to eat anyway, so we can continue chatting and swapping yarns and questioning Gillian. So please join me in thanking Gillian. And I'm delighted to say Gillian is coming as our guest to the dinner tonight, so you can talk to her then.
Thank you.
And the hotel is the old treasury building for the newer members of our civilization. It's Treasury 1860 is the name of the restaurant, and they're expecting us. So just over there, out the front door and straight across the road. It's on the corner of King William Street and Balmoral Road.
Look, if anyone's, I know we're probably running out of time, but if anyone's got time to stop and have a look at the books, I did bring some books in case people are interested. So I'll hang around for a little while. I'll have to pack them up anyway and take them all home if you don't buy them. But I'm just selling them at cost. I'm not making any money on these. It's just to make this sort of research available to people.
If everybody took one, we could take them all over there, and then Gillian could pack them over there.
Probably easier just to do it here.
Yeah, I think so.
And I can take, we can work out a way of doing electronic payments. It doesn't have to be cash.
That's our yeah, for sure. He's all right.
Very easy. Yeah, take it easy.